Okay, well, let's get started with our Respect Your Game panel featuring Dr. Courtney Cox. I'm Caroline Heldman, the Executive Director of the Representation Project and also the Chair of the Department of Critical Theory and Social Justice at Occidental College. And this panel is co-sponsored by both of those, I'm biased, but fantastic organizations. And it is my pleasure to turn the run of show in this entire event over to the person who organized it, Sky Reed. Sky is our social media manager at the Representation Project. She graduated summa cum laude from Occidental College with a degree in critical theory and social justice and a minor in philosophy. Sky's focus of study was on the intersection of theory and popular culture. She is passionate about media as a reflection of culture and as a tool of affirmation, particularly for underrepresented groups. Sky has previously worked in facilitation, leading small group discussions on social justice topics for middle and high school students. With no further ado, Sky Reed.
Thank you for that introduction, Caroline. Hello, everyone. Welcome. As Caroline shared, I'm Sky Reed, the social media manager at the Rep Project, an organization that uses media to fight sexism. Thank you for joining us today for our event about sexism in the coverage of the Winter Olympics with our special guest, Dr. Courtney Cox. Time permitting, we'll be taking audience questions at the end of the conversation, so feel free to just drop things into the Q&A, and then we'll get to them at the end. Now, to begin, please welcome Rebecca Cooper for a brief presentation about our latest research, analyzing the first week of primetime Winter Olympics coverage. Now, I will also give Becca a very nice bio, I think, or we can just dive into the research. Let's dive into the research.
Sorry, I did not mean to share my screen before you. Well, thank you for the intro you would have given me, and I appreciate that. I'm so excited to share with you our newest report on the Olympics. This is the second version of our Respect Her Game report, looking at the Winter Olympics. It's usual that we have the Winter Olympics following the Summer Olympics, so it just feels like there's Olympics all the time. But yes, so we just published this report looking at primetime coverage from the Winter Olympics and gender differences. So a little bit about the study. Just like the last study, we have two different types of content analysis that for this. The first is automated coding. So we did some face detection. We used some algorithms to detect faces and classify in order to get some stats on actual screen time and face time by gender in the first week of Olympic coverage, which was pretty awesome. Also, we had a team of researchers do some hand coding. So we looked at the first week of coverage, which means 25 hours of primetime Olympic coverage. And we analyzed 700 commentators, competitors, and on-the-ground interviewers. So without further ado, let's get into the findings. So the first finding we had is a positive finding and also on track with what we've seen from the Summer Olympics and the most recent Winter Olympics in Pyeongchang. So when it comes to presence and quantity of coverage, actually women athletes were pretty well represented in the Winter Olympics. So we have 54.8% of athletes featured were women in the first week of coverage, which is fantastic and also shows the continuation of a trend upwards in terms of equitable coverage for women in the Olympics. When we looked a little bit closer using our machine learning tool, however, we did see that when it comes to face time, so this is the second by second screen time for athletes, women were actually underrepresented. So even though more women athletes are showing up in the games and are making it into primetime coverage, less women athletes are actually being shown on screen during the duration of primetime coverage. And this is, we think from our qualitative analysis, it does seem like this is in part due to two prominent men athletes, Nathan Chen, a figure skater, and also Shaun White, a snowboarder, that they both got inflated coverage during prime time from the last week. So that means there were replays of their performances during prime time hours. And we also saw more features and more interviews with the two of them. But in general, this is a pretty astounding finding that even though we're seeing more women make it to primetime coverage and be featured, we're not actually seeing them. Another finding, which is pretty astounding and also mirrors what we found in the Summer Olympics, is that 8 out of 10 Olympic commentators in the Winter Olympics are men. And this is the same rate that we saw in the Winter Olympics. And as you can imagine, is a pretty surprising gap to see in 2022. This means that men are pretty much dominating the conversations that are happening while women athletes are performing. They're controlling how we understand the unfolding events, and also how both women and men and gender nonconforming athletes are being featured, which undoubtedly leads to differences in the quality of as well. So just taking a look at some of those gender differences, the first one that stuck out was women athletes were twice as likely for commentators to focus on their families than men athletes. And this is a finding that we've seen in many different studies, that typically women athletes are in their interviews and features. A lot of their success is attributed to their families, and they're spoken about as family members rather than athletes. And so, yeah, you can see twice as many women athletes had family as the focus of their features than men. And another gender difference we saw is that commentators were 3 times as likely to focus on women athletes' emotions. And we know that there are a lot of heartbreaking moments that happen in the Olympic Games. In the first week of coverage, there was plenty. And we saw both women and men break down and cry during and after competition segments. But the qualitative differences around how they are being portrayed and how commentators are focusing on those emotions were pretty stark. So not only did the numbers show that women were twice as likely to be discussed in emotional terms, but a qualitative example would be when Mikaela Shiffrin skied out, and the camera actually stayed on her for about 20 minutes in this position. And even cut to commercial on half of the screen and kept the camera on the other half of the screen fixed on her crying. Completely different than when Shaun White cried after he fell in his final run of his snowboarding competition. And we see him burst into tears, and the commentators, sort of glossed over it, mentioned that it was an important moment for Shaun White, but didn't fixate on the fact that he was being emotional. And also the camera didn't linger on him. They showed him for a second, talked about how monumental of a moment this was to end his career, and then kept it pushing. We didn't see any quantitative differences in terms of how relationships were brought up for men and women athletes, but qualitatively, we did notice some big differences. Interestingly enough, we had 2 couples that were both competing in the Olympics, and both of their races were shown in primetime. So it was kind of an interesting case to look at the difference between how the men and women were talked about in terms of their relationship. So first we had Mikaela Shiffrin and Alexander Kilde, who are both alpine skiers. And, many times the women their relationship would be brought up sort of while they're being introduced or at the very beginning of their competition segment. Whereas for the men, and Alexander Kilde would be there, they would talk about Alexander for a long time and then sort of briefly mention his relationship at the end of his competition segment. Actually, Mikaela was introduced as Alexander's girlfriend at one point. And then we also noticed just the length of time that relationships were discussed varied a lot. So for Michelle Marie Gagnon, I think I'm pronouncing her name right, her relationship, her engagement to fellow athlete Travis Gagnon was spoken about the entire time she skied down the hill, which took, I think, about 3 minutes. They discussed her being a future wife and their engagement and their plans together. And then in the same primetime hours, we got to see Travis ski down the hill, and they did not mention at all that he was engaged to Marie Michelle. So you can see that there were, even though the numbers don't show a difference in how relationships are talked about, we did notice gender differences when watching. The other thing we noticed, and this is not a surprise, unfortunately, is that women athletes are still more likely to be shown in revealing clothing than men athletes, still twice as likely. And this is even in the Winter Olympics. And we know that revealing clothing is often part of the conversation. It's part of gaining a competitive edge sometimes, and it's often part of being an athlete, but it tends to be more a part of being an athlete when we're talking about women athletes. So you can see the 2 figure skaters pictured here showing the differences in terms of competition, which makes it really clear that revealing clothing is not necessary to compete at an Olympic level in figure skating. We also did some text analysis and looked at gendered language. And the first thing we found was, just like the Summer Olympics, women were much more likely to be qualified with a gendered prefix. So this could mean female athlete, or referred to as a female skier, as opposed to just an athlete. This is, again, just sort of reinforcing the norm that men are the norm for athletes, and that women are othered or secondary. And again, we found some discrepancies with gendered language too. Women were 7 times more likely to be referred to with a gender diminutive than men athletes were. And the most common, again, were being called girls or ladies while they were performing. So some pretty big gender differences in terms of the quality of coverage. And so lastly, before I leave you, just again, our action steps, we have some for media executives and also for Olympic executives. For media executives, it is great that women are showing up more in prime time, but it's not enough. We need to actually see equitable screen time for women athletes and men athletes. We need more women analysts and interviewers on the ground. Definitely, there should not be 8 to 10 men commentators. In terms of how commentators are speaking about athletes, they should be using the term athlete for everybody instead of gendering the term. And also they should be avoiding focusing on families and emotions to describe women athletes. And of course, we would like for them to stop using gender diminutive terms. So girls, ladies, chick, princess are all examples of terms that we saw in this and the last Olympics. And for Olympic executives, it would be fantastic if we could allow women and men to wear whatever they want to compete, and sort of get rid of this standard for women to be competing only in revealing clothing. And that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Becca, for that breakdown of the research. For everyone that's attending, I just dropped a link to the Respect Her Game report in the chat. It goes to our website, and please share that link widely. And now it's my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Courtney Cox. Dr. Cox is an academic expert in a variety of issues located at the intersection of sport and society. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Indigenous, Race, and Ethnic Studies at the University of Oregon. She's currently working on two monographs, and she is a former ESPN employee and has also worked at NPR affiliate KPCC in Pasadena, California. Courtney, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So to kick us off, Becca just presented these findings showing that while women have made progress in Olympic coverage, sexism persists in the quality of that coverage. And she just gave us some great examples on how that has been happening throughout the Winter Olympics. Why would you say that this is such a persistent problem?
Well, sexism is a persistent problem societally, so we are seeing those reflections. Sport is such a vivid reflection of that. And I think this report really shows us in vivid detail. And I think as this research is ongoing, there's all these different ways we are seeing this, both in terms of who can talk about sport, who's read as expert, the commentators, right? So 8 out of 10, that's very wild when we look at how many women are competing, how many current and former athletes could be involved in this space. We love seeing athletes that have the expertise getting into the booth. And so from my perspective as a media studies scholar, I first think about everyone from the folks that are the executives that are making the decisions about not only who's hired to cover sport, but what decisions are made. That primetime slot is so important, and thinking about that, right? And so from the perspective we have in the United States, so thinking about how every country has their own broadcast and is really sharing the Olympics in different ways. So thinking about, we're looking at it from a US context, I'm really both encouraged by thinking about this also being the 50th anniversary of Title IX this year, thinking about all those inroads that are happening from the athlete perspective, but from the executive perspective, who makes the decisions, who's on camera, who's read as expert. I'm really tuned in to thinking about how those shifts still aren't happening. And we see that across the board. There's so many longitudinal studies that really show how much hasn't changed in the coverage of women's sports, whether we're thinking about the Olympics or just year round, the coverage and how we're seeing it from, again, a US perspective. But I think, as I see also in the comments, there are ways that this is very much a transnational trend too. We see this across other spaces as well outside of the US.
So specifically, I know that you're teaching a course this semester on the Olympics, how would you say that the Winter Olympics occurring currently is affecting your teaching process and the learning process for your students?
I mean, I'm grateful for the Olympics happening during this class. The class is called Race, Class, Empire, the Olympics. And there's a lot to talk about when we think about race, class, and empire, especially thinking about the racial and gender representations of the Winter Olympics specifically. And so for me, as I have this moment, my class is an archival one. We get into the archives, we look at really cool, really old stuff. And then there are these parallels that we see as we're also watching the Winter Olympics right now. And so I feel so grateful. I have incredible students that are really digging into this stuff. And so thinking about the parallels, even when we're looking at like 1932 Olympics, right? And thinking about the 32 Olympics and how women are covered and how women are discussed in that frame, and seeing those parallels that very much mirror this report. It's really, for us, we're able to see these trends as they change or they don't. And so I think there is an interesting way to see an Olympics kind of unfold, this living archive as it's playing out every day for us, and thinking about the ramifications. We're thinking about protests, whether we're thinking about what countries are legible to the IOC, whether we're thinking about representation, whether we're thinking about performance enhancing drugs, like all of these things, as we're discussing them, there are all these vivid examples I get to pull from every day that are happening in real time. So I'm very grateful. And I love that class. I could talk about it all day, so I'll stop there.
The next question actually, I think, can still be tied into that class, so you have the opportunity to talk about it a little bit more. So as a scholar in this subject, as you're collecting this archive, you mentioned this trend over the period of time. You mentioned, I think, the 1930s, I want to say, and just having these notable examples throughout this period of time. So how would you describe this trend? And do you have any examples from within this archive to pull from, and how women athletes have been portrayed?
Yeah, so I mean, I brought up the 32, which was held in Los Angeles, but one of the things that I think about, and the example that's so vivid that my students alert me to as they're going through stuff too, is noticing, the Olympic Village is formed, but women are staying in hotels. They're not allowed in the Olympic Village. And so thinking about all of these different ways this is happening over time, where women stay, what they're wearing, thinking about the uniforms, thinking about what sports they're allowed to compete in the Olympics, thinking about how late it is when we think about sports like basketball, right? How long it takes for women to be even incorporated, right? When we think about the father of the modern Olympics, Pierre de Coubertin, and his disdain for women competing, he's like, this is an eyesore, right? And so my students are able to see letters he's written, complaints he's made, and other IOC presidents like Avery Brundage across time that are always complaining about, why do women insist on being in this sporting space? And so I think there's something very vivid about students being able to see these documents, these official records. And now these things are sometimes emails, or seeing printed emails that are in the archive as well. And so it's one thing for us to talk about this lack of coverage, the dearth of really focused attention, the way we're still worried about women being wives and sisters and moms, right? We can see this trend, you can see it in print. And so there's something really vivid about that, of thinking about from the folks that are doing the media coverage, or we're thinking about the folks that are actually involved in the decision-making, from the IOC to the national organizing committees and Olympic committees, thinking about all of these old documents that are telling this very vivid story about all the ways that women and non-binary folks have had to fight every step of the way to be fully included. And we see in this report and other amazing research how there's still this lack of equity that's happening in these spaces.
There really is that lack of equity. And I think one thing that we know about the Olympics, or that we can note, is that women athletes receive so much more coverage during the Olympics than they do during the average sports cycle or their sports season. Ordinarily, I think they receive less than 4% of coverage. And I think, why is this such a difference, and how do you imagine this disparity be addressed?
Yeah. I also want to shout out Hugo. Hugo, I'm talking about the 1932 Summer Games, just FYI. And one of the interesting things, I think, also, just to shout out that comment, I appreciate it, is thinking about what this means in terms of the winter and summer games being held. They used to be held the same year. And so I just want to also, I'm thinking about Becca's comment about this whiplash of like just finishing Tokyo and then also getting thrown back in. So thinking about the ramifications of the fact we used to have them so close together in that way versus this 2-year break that we now have. But thinking about that, one of the reasons that I think that we see differences in coverage versus, what we see year round in terms of these disparities is because of the broadcast rights. Again, going this very top-down understanding because of the location. So thinking about the fact that, for example, if we think about March Madness and obviously the disparities in the NCAA we've talked about. And so I want to think about what that might mean when it's the same broadcast teams covering everyone. There are those limitations, as Becca's talking about, I think are so important. But then the other side of that is this idea of covering all of it versus when we think about March Madness, the men being covered differently, having different broadcast rights versus the women. And so thinking about what it means when you're in the same city, the same place, being covered by the same broadcast team. There's something about that I think is doing something. And I think there's been conversations across other sports, whether we're thinking about the College World Series, for example, or thinking about March Madness. What would it mean if we had both men's and women's teams occupy the same city at the same time? Some folks are like, well, no one would go see the women, which I very much doubt. But I think there's something about what it means for advertising revenue, what it means to have eyes, what it means to decide prime time. I think there are issues we have to talk about in terms of who's seeing women's sports as worthy of prime time, of worthy of being in the space. But I think what we're seeing when we see this closer to equitable or way more women's coverage than we normally see in other sports or year round, I think it has to do with that linkage that's happening there, the time, the location, and the broadcast rights being intertwined in a really important way. So we're still battling those equity issues, as we know, as this report is telling us. But I think that's one of the things that I point to that could be a reason. I'm also interested if folks want to drop in the chat as well what they're thinking. Why is the Olympics this space? What part of patriotism or nationalism might also play into this as well? I think is a worthy question. Outside of logistics, the cultural side of that might be playing in a different way.
I think that that's a great point. It also reminds me, you were talking about college basketball, and I think now we have the women's basketball, I think, being included in March Madness advertising or branding. Mm-hmm. And so it'll be curious to see over the next few years how that actually shifts the way that people talk about and view women's basketball. And who's to say if it'll do anything, but hopefully it will. Hopefully this added attention and added branding will create a good shift for them. And so we're still talking about the Olympics. We're talking about how it takes place on that global stage and how that may affect how people are tuning in to watch the sport, particularly in the sense that some people are tuning into the Olympics to watch sports that ordinarily would never do so. So can we talk about the unique effects that the Olympics has and the Olympic coverage has on the way we view women in sports? How, if at all, do these impacts differ from the non-Olympic sports coverage?
Yeah, I mean, there's ways that because of this, one of the things Lawrence Winter talks about, incredible sport comm scholar, is this idea of sports dirt. There's this residue of sport that allows us to sell a lot of things. And so from one perspective, it makes women athletes more marketable in a really important way, right? So part of it, we can talk about what products women are selling versus, men on that front, right? So Simone Biles and Tide, for example. But I think that there's something really important for their bottom line, for their livelihoods, right? That I think is a signal, right? So not this idea that capitalism will save us, but I think there's a really important note about that heightened visibility. We're not just seeing them compete the sport, but they can also be strong and beautiful and sell us things and knowledgeable. And I think there's something about that. Even if you don't follow the sport, there are folks that may not follow sports in general, but know these people become household names in a way that a lot of women athletes don't, unfortunately. And so I think the fact that there's this global scale, this idea of this is what everyone is talking about when we think about the World Cup, when we think about the Olympics, when we think about the Super Bowl, right? These heightened mega sporting events that are the thing that you have to know about or have to consume in order to have a conversation with your peers. So there's like this peer pressure, even if you're not a sports person, to know a little bit about what's going on, or like, who is Nathan Chen, right? And so thinking about these things, I think there's part of that. And I think the other side of it is I get excited when I have students in my class that for some reason take a sports class, but don't watch sports, but they'll be like, oh, Chloe Kim, right? So there's ways that recognition means something to me of, I don't follow sports, but I know about this one athlete, or this athlete seems to represent me or my culture, or there's these things that resonate. And I think it's that sports dirt, that residue of it that speaks to these larger forms of representation that I think are so important. So I think this idea of being recognizable, as a kid, my very first random shout out, I first fell in love with sport. One of my very first favorite sports was figure skating. And Kristi Yamaguchi, I know I'm dating myself, was my favorite athlete. And for me, I started figure skating because of Kristi Yamaguchi. And so I was this kid in Texas that loved figure skating and football. And so there was this interesting thing of seeing an athlete in this space, probably in prime time, and getting to have this resonance of something that maybe I could do, right? And so there's something about this recognizable potential. There's all types of bodies on display in the Summer and Winter Olympics. There's a way that you can identify with so many people, and there's so many stories. And I do think storytelling and narrative is important. I do want to hear about their families, but I want to hear about them equitably, right? That can't be the only story we tell about women. This idea of this couple is such an amazing case study of how I want to hear about it from both perspectives. I want to keep hearing these stories. And then I think about one of the things that I'm interested in is thinking about how we translate that interest outside the Olympics, especially for sports that have leagues that play year round, like the WNBA or the NWSL, right? How can we support the National Women's Hockey League year round, not just during the Olympics, not just when they represent the nation? And that's the translation I would love to see, is like, if we have this interest during the Olympics, how do we keep this energy year round for these incredible athletes at all levels?
I thank you so much for that answer. It also, everything that you're saying keeps reminding me of different things that are happening in the news. So for instance, a couple of weeks ago, we had the WNBA player Liz Cambage pointing out the inequitable, I think, pay structure at the WNBA. And she cited the fact that she has to pay for her own flights or upgrade her own flights, for instance. And just thinking about how coverage also plays into that. When you have this added income, when you have this added investment, you are able to do a little bit more, and hopefully don't need to upgrade your own flights. Hopefully your workplace will do that for you, since you are making them tons and tons and tons of money. So we talked, I think that you hit this a little bit in your previous answer, but I'm curious about how athletes specifically are impacted by this persistent sexism in sports coverage. And I'll also remind our audience that if you have questions, to toss them in the Q&A, because this is our last pre-planned question.
Yeah, so for me, and just to go back, as someone that's writing a book about women's basketball, I mean, it's really egregious that Brittany Griner was given middle seats, right? So just think about how much I'm 5'4", so I'll tell you, I don't like the middle seat on a plane, but can you imagine being 6'8", right? And being asked to sit in a middle seat, right? So Liz, and you know, I'm thinking about my bigs when I'm thinking about like, how are you going to have centers like sitting in a middle seat, right? So this idea of upgrading yourself, right? Having to do this. I think about the NWSL, thinking about on the soccer front, the No More Side Hustles campaign. So thinking about how they're directly impacted, this idea of, I want to just be an athlete. I don't want to have to go get 4 other side jobs in order to play the sport I love. I want to fully lean into it and dedicate myself to, it's a craft, right? And so thinking about that, I think about the lack of coverage leads to the lack of endorsement opportunities. I think about how these things are racialized. I think about what it means in terms of class, who has access to these spaces in the first place, because there are all these myths about this kind of like underdog story, and we love them so much, about coming from nothing, right? We see all of these stories, these narratives, these 30 for 30s, but the reality is most athletes that are going to play at a college or professional level are middle class, because you have to afford all of these things and special coaches and play club team and play and travel, right? And so one of the things that happens is there's the barrier to access once you get there, and then thinking about who can actually stay in this space as an elite athlete because of the lack of opportunity, the lack of pay, right? And so when we talk about these pay structures, that comes down to investment, right? Investing in these sports, because we know historically men's sports had to do that too, right? And so when we see these histories, if we make comparative ones, there are so many leagues that are doing so much better than their male counterparts did in the first 10 years, 20 years, 30 years of their league. And so I'm really careful to, when I'm making these comparisons, I'm thinking in my 2022 brain of where these leagues are, right? Not thinking about the ways that sexism has impacted the development and the longevity of these leagues historically, constantly. So one of the things that I'm really excited about on that front of thinking about how there's all of this impact that's happening, and NIL at the college level is a new form of that as that emerges, right? So who can be read as marketable on the college front too? What sports are marketable? And Olympic sports at the college level open up a lot of opportunity potentially for women to make money through NIL because there is that global reach, that global range that wasn't previously available to them in order to make money year round as they compete in a sport that they may only see the global stage every 4 years. So I'm excited about the investment potential, seeing these new investors coming into the NWSL, a lot of current and former athletes, women athletes investing in other women athletes. Seeing that in hockey and soccer is incredible. The WNBA just secured a new massive multi-million-dollar investment. So it's not all bleak. There's a future ahead, I think, that is about this investment, not this like, oh, you should go to a game, or this kind of like charity, like you should pity women's sports. It's like, no, they just want the money in their hand and they should have it. And so I think these big body investments into women's sports will help that proliferation and also help girls that are growing up know that there is an outlet. You don't have to stop playing after high school or college, right? Knowing that there's a future there, and knowing there's a future outside of just playing the sport. I think I still want to go back to that 8 out of 10 broadcasters, right? I think it's important to see yourself and see the potential of being someone that's calling a game, whether it's the men's game or the women's game. I think it's really important that there's these other opportunities to own a team, right? To cover these incredible leagues. And so knowing that there's that potential, right, I think is really important. And so the investment that's going in right now, I think will pay out dividends over time for sure. I think there's this moment we're sitting in, we're restless. We've been waiting. We've been putting in the time. We've wanted to see these athletes compete at the highest level and also be recognized and compensated for their work. And so now it's time. Now the investment for me, I'm like, it's time to pay up.
Thank you so much. That is, yeah, I'm excited to see all of these investments kind of come to fruition and see women athletes and just women in sports in general, whether that's on the field or behind the camera, or I guess sometimes on the camera if they're commentators, to see them reach to really get these investments and be treated better by their industry. So now we're going to go to audience Q&A. Again, if y'all have any questions, please drop them in. This first question is actually for Becca. So it asks, Hugo asks, is there analysis of the difference between the way that male and female commenters and the language they use?
So we don't have this breakdown in part because there were so few women commentators that we didn't have quite the numbers to do additional analysis of that, but just qualitatively watching, well, what we do know is there were no gender differences in terms of women and men commentators focusing on the family, focusing on the other finding we found, focusing on emotions. It did not matter if the commentator was a man or a woman. For that, we didn't find any significant difference. But again, that's mostly driven by the fact that there were so few commentators. I would love to see the impacts of, I would love to have more data so we could really see how having so many men analysts truly impacts the quality of the coverage that's happening. So to answer your question, no, but I would love to see that.
Oh, didn't realize I was on mute. Thank you, Becca, for that answer. And now we have a question for Courtney again about funding. So this Nicole Edwards, she actually gave a anecdote. So what she says is that in Canada, we have next to no funding for university level women's sports, which is very different than big US colleges. I think the impact I think this impacts general interest in watching women's sports and maybe even limits young girls from aspiring to play. Yet when Canadian women win big gold in hockey last night, and gold in soccer last summer in Tokyo, I'm always left wondering how much more impactful it could be if we actually funded women's sports. So she says that she doesn't know if there's a question here, but she would love more for us to talk a little bit more about the impact of funding and raising interest in women's sports beyond the Olympics.
Yeah. First of all, congratulations, Nicole. Incredible game. Shout out to the Canadian women for that amazing win. I think it's, and I will also say that I think that gold medal game was just kind of a win in general for women's sports because it was kind of just buzzing everywhere. And I love the hype and excitement. One of the other big things I would be interested to see if the report would be interested in how like the lead up, how much we build suspense and talk about women's sports going into it. So one of the big critiques I see in general about media is that we'll have a women's game and the halftime will be recaps of men's games instead of other women's games. And we never do that on the men's side. We don't get halftime where they're going to give us the scores from the women's side. And so I'm thinking about that media side. To answer your question, the funding I talked about were for these private leagues, but you make a really great point about national Olympic committees, right? So how much countries invest into the national teams, right? And so thinking about where those disparities might be as well, I think is important. So the impact of funding and raising interest in women's sports beyond the Olympics, thinking about this as a heightened moment where we have the most equity and coverage that we really can hang our hats on versus the 4% we get the rest of the time. I think it's really important, again, to fund from the youth sports level up to the most elite level. I think it's absolutely necessary. And we see those disparities between countries at the Olympics constantly about who's investing and who's not, right? And when we think about something like Winter Olympic sports, in particular, tend to be really sometimes very expensive sports. And so I also want to think about the class disparities that happen there too. And so I really appreciate this question. I think there is a question there. I don't have a super, super easy solution, but I do think there's a massive impact that is connected to both the media coverage that results from this, right? And the ways that we can rally around these teams in these moments and yet can't continue to fund them. So there's this future, when we think about these legacies, these massive, these teams that can go 4 or 5 Olympics, gold medals in a row, that takes a lot of funding, investment, interest that goes beyond the 2 weeks of the Olympics. And so I think that's a really, really important part of like seeing there's more investment, right? Because we're seeing more women that are competing, but we need those investments all around. And we need it to be, as you mentioned, outside of these US contexts, right? So there are these incredible competitors globally can link up in all of the ways beyond the Olympics, right? So everything from thinking about things like the Pan American Games, these other global competitions that happen, FIFA, FIBA, all these places, and thinking about that. So I think the impact of funding, not just when it's on these biggest stages, but also thinking about all of the other competitions, all the other ways that we can help get more folks in that move across class and racial barriers as well.
Thank you so much for that thorough answer. This next question is also going to be for Becca. It's going to go back to Becca. So can you speak a little bit more about the difference between the number of women athletes versus screen time for athletes? Why was there such a difference, do you think?
Yeah, and this is such a major finding, especially since we've been seeing headlines touting that this is the most gender balanced Winter Olympics we've seen. And in some cases, that is true. If you're looking at just the athlete count, then absolutely, we're seeing more women competing, and we're also seeing more women making it to prime time. But that discrepancy between women athletes competing and then the amount of screen time and actual showing their faces is really interesting. And it's a trend we see in media too, just because when we're looking at film and TV, just because more women are cast or even cast in prominent roles, sometimes there's a discrepancy there between being cast in that role and then actual screen time and speaking time. And, just from our qualitative analysis, looking at what happened, it was interesting how often women's features, women athletes features would focus on men in their lives, right? So and even when they're not being featured, but during competition segments, the camera would end up veering to their men coaches, to their fathers cheering them on, to their boyfriends or their husbands. And you know, just like Dr. Cox said, it's not necessarily a bad thing to see somebody's father cheering for them, or to learn about the importance of somebody's father or a male coach in their life in their featured segment. But when it's inequitable like that, it really kind of shakes out when you look at the data. And in terms of how, you know, in terms of how often we're actually seeing women on screen, it just wasn't equitable. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it really I think came down to the amount of men's performances and competition segments that were replayed during primetime hours. Like we saw all of Nathan Chen's competitions twice because they would play them the next day. Extended interviews with Shaun White. Obviously this was his last year competing, but he was not the only athlete that had stories that were worthy of extended interviews. And then again, featuring men during women's competition segments and features in a way that was not, we didn't see that when men were being featured or competing.
Thank you for that answer.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm also gonna, again, hop back to Courtney. So how do you imagine a more equitable sports world? What would this look like? How might we get there? And how would this affect the broader culture? And this is from an anonymous attendee. Thank you for your question, anonymous attendee.
Well, I love that that's like the hardest hitting set of questions, right? This is the big thing. I think, so one of the things that I think is often touted within sport, and I have a lot of feelings about this, but this idea of sport being sometimes ahead of society, this idea of like, you know, Jackie Robinson has shouted out, or like, you know, there's idea that sport is bringing society forward and making it more progressive. And I think I'm more the person that it reflects kind of where we actually are, right? What we're actually ready for. And sometimes it's very progressive, sometimes it's very regressive compared to what's happening in society at large. And so I find sport to be such an important battleground to tell us who we actually are and where we actually are. And so one of the things that I imagine through sport, I'd love imagining and dreaming a better world, right? It's very easy for us to talk about all the problems, which we definitely have to do to work towards that. But dreaming of a different world, a world we haven't seen yet, where all bodies are brought to the space. This idea, if you have a body or an athlete, that everyone can, regardless of where we come from, what we look like, what we do, what we love to do, who we love, all of these things, we can come into the space of sport. This is something that makes us human. We love playing. We love finding out about our world and finding out about ourselves through sport. So for me, a more equitable sports world would be a place where everyone can come to the table, right? And and for me, thinking about an athlete first perspective, I center athletes in my world, in my work and in my world in general, thinking academically. One of the things that I think about is how many of the decisions that are made about athletes' lives are not made by athletes. And so for me, a more equitable world starts with making sure it's a space where anyone can be an athlete in these spaces. And then thinking about from a management level, thinking from the IOC, all these spaces, 10% of the IOC executive committee are royalty. These are the people making decisions. This is mostly white Western men making decisions for the entire world in this space. And so for me, I think it comes down to wanting a world where athletes who are most affected by these policies and decisions are able to be at the table. There's so many of these tables, they aren't even allowed in the room. So for me, one of the things that I imagine is I, as an academic, don't want to make decisions for athletes. I want them to have the agency and the autonomy to make decisions that are best for them, their families, their health. There's a great question here, thinking about the health and safety of athletes, right? And so as fans, as passionate as we are, as much we love sports, coaches, as much as they want to win, we aren't always the best to make the decisions for athletes that are actually in their well-being. And so for me, in my work and in my life, I really try to center their words, their ideas, the ways that they're theorizing about their space. And I think we would do well to do that in all aspects, right? How do athletes want to be covered? What angles are they not comfortable with? There's a great piece from the report from the last summer about how there are these angles that are used for women that are not used for men in terms of how they're photographed, right? And so for me, if we're asking athletes, they know who would be great in their sport to cover them, experts that will be great commentators. And for a lot of women's sports, they're thinking about the women that have been the trailblazers for them. And so for me, I imagine a more equitable sports world that is athlete centered, about their own health. All the disparities, the abuses that athletes have suffered, I think are different when we have them in the driver's seat of actually having voice and agency, and helping to make great decisions. So I think how that affects broader culture, that also for me as someone that studies labor primarily, I think about that, how we all think about our labor. I think that one of the things that I learned about myself with Simone Biles, for example, last summer is the ability to say no and the importance of saying no. And so one of the ways that I've been affected by sport is when athletes do stand up for themselves and take agency and speak out. It makes me feel a little braver to do that too, to admit that I don't have it. If Simone Biles can admit that she's not at her best, she doesn't have it, like that's such an important thing for me, who has not accomplished anything near what she's accomplished. And I haven't had to do it in such a public way. I think it affects broader society because there are these very brave athletes and voices, and they are willing to share their lives with us in a particular way. And so I hope that that would affect broader culture for everyone else. I can only speak for myself of how athletes shape how I move through the world, but I'm really inspired. These are young people doing important, incredible things on the biggest stages. And so I'm in awe of them constantly, and I learn from them. And I wish that these institutions, committees, leagues would do the same.
Thank you so much. I love that answer. I love the thought that you put into it. And so I know that we have a few more of these Q&A questions, but I do want to kind of close us out with this final one, with just one more. And this is actually just to you, Courtney, but I think that it would be a fun question for all of us to answer. So it says, what events / athletes are you most excited about this Olympics? And I know that Becca has been watching a ton of Olympic footage, a ton of it. But how are we feeling about this question? What events or athletes are we most excited for, or have we been most excited for? Let's start with you, Courtney.
I want to say Eileen Gu is probably the athlete that I'm most into. And I think one of the things that I've really picked up on this particular Winter Olympics, as someone that has recently gotten into snowboarding, I had this one kind of awful accident recently. And so I am now fully recovered from that. But this is the first time I've kind of watched a lot of sports, realizing how difficult it really is to just get on the board, stay on the board. And then skiing, I'm like, I have no idea. But one of the things I'm really excited about, so Eileen, probably one of them for me. The other thing that I have always kind of been into, but this Olympics has been really fantastic for me, curling has kind of taken over. I've been curling has probably been my favorite, just because I'm now Googling techniques and trying to learn more. So I will say curling is a sport. Eileen Gu is the athlete that I've been most taken with so far this Olympics.
Thank you for that answer. What about you, Becca?
So I don't know really what's coming up in this next week that I'm looking forward to, although I agree that curling has become a new obsession, mainly because of how funny they look while they're brushing the ice with their little brushes. But I think some things, I'm going to answer this a little differently, but some things I'm looking forward to with the Olympics in general I'm interested to see how Sha'Carri Richardson gets recognized after what's happened with Camilla. And Sha'Carri's from Louisiana, I'm in New Orleans, and it's just such a blatant discrepancy, such a blatant double standard. I would really love to see how globally she is responded to and how this double standard gets acknowledged. And then also so in terms of Olympics gossip, I also am looking forward to more mixed events and more events where women are allowed to compete in the same competitions that the men are. Like we saw in gymnastics that they're starting to allow women to do some of the I don't even know what I know for instance, there's in swimming over the Summer Olympics that women were finally allowed to do one of the lengths that was previously unavailable to them in the Olympic Games. And I know there was something for gymnastics too, but when we talk about discrepancies in the Olympics for gender, it's really fascinating how the rules around who can do a quad and who can do a triple tuck in snowboarding. Obviously, I don't know what I'm talking about, but it's just interesting that women and men are not allowed to compete in the same ways. And I think that's slowly starting to get dismantled. And every Olympic Games, we kind of see a new area where women can compete. And so that is exciting to me.
Thank you for that answer. I think there was also during the Summer Olympics, it may have been the first time that they did a mixed relay race. So that was another great moment of just seeing people compete together wherever possible. And yeah, also having the same rules. I was also shocked to find out that the quad, like, this is so historic also because it just hasn't been previously allowed. And then of course there's more conversation to be had about that with regards to the doping and everything. But for a little bit, it was really exciting. So now we're gonna wind down. That was our last question. Thank you to everyone for joining us. Thank you, Courtney, for attending this event and giving us such like thorough answers to our questions. We look forward to having everybody at future events, and you can find out more information about the Rep Project's events calendar on our website. And I am just going to drop the link to that in the chat if I can. Yes, I just found it. Okay, I just dropped that in the chat so everybody can visit there and see our full events calendar. See you all soon. Thank you again so much for joining us.